The road outside Ohrdruf was quiet on the morning of April 12, 1945. No artillery, no engines stacking up at a bend. Just a line of German civilians in good wool coats, walking slowly where soldiers pointed toward a gate that had been standing open for 8 days. These weren't prisoners. They were the town's bankers, shopkeepers, a mill owner in a pressed shirt, handkerchiefs pressed to their mouths, a rifle slung low, just visible. They kept insisting they had never known what was behind that fence. This is what Patton did when an entire town swore it saw nothing. It started, on paper, as nothing at all. When the 4th Armored Division broke through the outer wire 8 days earlier, the first radio call back to battalion used the flattest language available. A camp. Possibly a labor facility. The sergeant calling it in, a 23-year-old from Ohio named Walt Fury, didn't have better words yet. He had a younger brother somewhere in the Pacific, and he'd been trained to report what he saw in clean military phrases, not in the language of what he was actually looking at. So the first report sounded almost routine. A camp. Detainees. Conditions poor. 3 words. That was all battalion got that first hour, and 3 words were not nearly enough. That phrase, conditions poor, would survive in the paperwork for 3 more days before anyone corrected it. 3 days, while the column behind Fury's unit kept rolling east, while maps got marked and remarked, while nobody above him understood what those 3 words were actually hiding. Fury himself didn't sleep much those first nights. He'd seen things at the wire he couldn't fit into any letter home, and he wasn't going to try. What he could do was watch the road outside the camp, the one running straight toward town, and notice something that bothered him more the longer he looked at it. There was no fence keeping local traffic from passing within sight of the gate. No checkpoint, no diversion, nothing built to hide the place from the people living 2 miles away. Whoever had run this camp hadn't built it to be hidden. They'd built it, assuming nobody nearby would ever ask. The captain who arrived behind Fury's patrol, a man named Daniel Ross, had spent the war so far managing supply lines and traffic control. He had never stood over the dead in numbers his mind could not process. His instinct, trained into him by months of logistics work, was to secure the perimeter, log the find, and keep the column moving east. That was his job. Cordon it off, note the coordinates, pass it up the chain. He did exactly that. And in doing exactly that, he almost let the truth get buried inside a folder labeled routine. Ross wasn't careless. He was simply doing the job he had been trained for, in a situation no training had prepared him to recognize. Division staff received Ross's report and made it smaller, not bigger. Whoever drafted the next version up the chain used the phrase detention facility, not because anyone was lying, because nobody wanted to be the officer who overstated something this disturbing and turned out to be wrong. Caution, in this case, worked exactly like denial. It softened the truth until the truth almost disappeared inside careful language. Each rewrite up the chain made the camp sound a little smaller, a little more manageable, a little easier to file and forget. That might have been the end of it. A quiet camp, a quiet report, the army moving on, the way armies are built to move on. Except the war was almost over, and Eisenhower and Bradley happened to be touring the front that same week. And except for one detail nobody in the chain could soften enough to make disappear, the camp sat less than 2 miles from a town of several thousand people who used the same road every single day. You have to understand how close it was. The road from Ohrdruf into the camp wasn't hidden behind a forest or buried down some logging track nobody used. It ran past farms, past the edge of town, past windows. People opened every morning to air out their houses. For months, residents had walked or driven that road on ordinary business, to the mill, to market, to church on Sunday. They had smelled smoke that did not behave like ordinary smoke. They had seen forced laborers marched along the verge, thin men in striped cloth, moving in lines that didn't match anything a normal labor crew should look like. None of that proved any single person understood the full scope of what was happening behind the fence. But it made the town's collective answer, "We did not know," much harder to leave standing once the gate came open. Burgomaster Heinrich Vogt was the man who would end up saying that line out loud, to Patton's face, through an interpreter who hated every word of it. Vogt was in his late 50s, the owner of the town's largest mill, the kind of man whose word carried weight at the council table and the church door alike. His mill had supplied flour and feed across the district for 30 years. He prided himself on respectability, the way some men pride themselves on courage. When American officers first approached the town with questions, Vogt gave the answer that came naturally to a man who had built his whole identity on being known and trusted. "We did not know." He believed it when he said it. Or he had arranged over many months, quietly and without ever naming it to himself, to believe it. That answer satisfied the captains and lieutenants who asked it first, not because they believed him completely, but because none of them had the standing to push past a respected local official without orders that didn't exist yet. A lieutenant pressed once and got nowhere. He had no authority to compel a civilian leader to do anything but answer questions politely and move on. A battalion officer treated the whole matter as a logistics problem, the same instinct Ross had shown at the gate. Secure it, document it, move forward. Let someone higher up decide what any of it meant. Nobody at that level was equipped or willing to turn a town's denial into a command decision. By the time the question climbed past division and landed near the top of the chain, 8 days had passed, and the silence around Ohrdruf had calcified into something closer to policy than confusion. That was the moment it stopped being a battlefield discovery. It became something else entirely. A test of whether an army that had just won the argument with weapons could also win the argument with memory. Each failure on the way up had its own shape, and none of them looked like cowardice exactly. The lieutenant who first questioned Vogt was 24 years old and had been in command of men for less than a year. He didn't have the rank to make a respected German civic leader do anything he didn't want to do, and he knew it the moment he opened his mouth. The battalion officer who inherited the problem next had spent the war managing convoy schedules and supply manifests, and his mind ran on the same track it always had. Secure, document, escalate, move on. He wasn't wrong to do his job. He was simply the wrong kind of officer to recognize that this particular problem wasn't a logistics problem at all. By the time it reached regiment, the officers there understood the scale better and tried applying pressure. Formal letters, a request for a fuller accounting from the town council, but pressure without trust just produced more careful denials, more polished versions of, "We did not know." Nobody at any of those levels had the standing or the stomach to turn a civilian town's collective memory into a military order. That required someone willing to be blamed for it personally. Patton heard about it through a report that had been smoothed over one too many times. He read the careful phrasing, labor facility, conditions poor, and something about the wording struck him as wrong. Not wrong like a lie, wrong like a man choosing his words because the truth wouldn't fit cleanly into a sentence. He did not send someone to verify it. He decided to see it himself. He arrived on April 12th by jeep, with Bradley and Eisenhower beside him, the three of them moving through dust and a silence that didn't match the pace they usually kept. Whatever the men guarding the gate expected from Patton's arrival, and after years under his command, they expected speed, noise, a fast inspection, and a faster departure. What they got instead was stillness. He walked through slowly. He stopped at one building and did not go in. A guard standing nearby tried to describe what was inside and couldn't finish the sentence. Patton didn't push him to finish it. "What's in there?" he asked, already knowing he wasn't going to ask twice. He didn't enter that building. Later, accounts from men who were there describe him physically sickened by what he'd already seen elsewhere in the camp. Not staged outrage, not performance for the officers around him, but a reaction even he could not fully control. The pacing of the whole visit changed after that. Fewer words, shorter exchanges. The kind of quiet that makes everyone around a commander pay closer attention, not less. Eisenhower, walking the same ground, had already reached his own conclusion. As many soldiers as possible needed to see this before the war ended, because he believed, and said as much, plainly to the men around him, that someday people would try to claim it never happened. That single instruction would shape what happened next, far more than any document or directive drafted at headquarters. And Patton's part of it played out on the road outside the wire, in front of Burgomaster Vogt. The civilians were brought forward in a line along the camp's main path. Prominent townspeople, the ones whose word carried weight in the district, the ones who could not later claim they were nobody, that nobody would have listened to them anyway. Soldiers stood at intervals along the path, rifles slung, faces unreadable. Vogt stood near the front, his coat buttoned despite the morning warmth, the same coat he wore to council meetings. An army interpreter, Corporal Anna Liss, stood near Patton, translating. Liss had grown up hearing German spoken at her grandmother's kitchen table, soft and familiar, full of small comforts. She hated every syllable she had to translate that morning. Vogt said it plainly, the way a respected man says something he has decided, after long practice, is simply true. We did not know. Liss translated it. Patton looked at him for a long moment before answering, long enough that the silence itself became part of the answer. Then you'll know. Now. It wasn't a threat dressed up as a threat. It wasn't theater. The men expecting Patton to scream, to humiliate, to make an example through sheer volume, didn't get that. What they got instead was quieter, and in its own way, much harder to walk away from. Money wouldn't have solved this, and everyone standing on that road understood it without being told. A fine against the town, an arrest of a few prominent men, an angry denunciation read aloud for the record. All of it would have ended the same way, with men like Vogt able to claim later that they had been bullied into a confession that wasn't true, that the Americans had simply needed someone to blame. Punishment closes a door. It doesn't open eyes. What the situation actually demanded wasn't a confession at all. It was a witness who couldn't later say he hadn't seen. So instead of arrests, instead of fines, instead of a speech delivered for the record, Patton ordered the civilians to walk the camp. Not a quick, symbolic pass near the gate. All of it. Slowly. He had them assigned to help with the burial work that was already underway. The prominent men of the town picking up shovels alongside soldiers who had been doing the grim work for 8 days straight. A soldier nearby muttered to Fury, low enough that it almost didn't carry. Make them walk all of it. That was the order, in practice if not in exact wording. Not a punishment measured in days or fines, but a forced confrontation with scale. Fury's unit escorted the civilians through, past row after row, past evidence that no careful phrase from any report could have prepared them for. Ross, still managing the paperwork side of things, documented what was found as the work continued, finally writing reports that didn't soften anything, that used the plain words instead of the careful ones. Liss stayed close to Patton, translating instructions, translating refusals, translating the long silences that followed both. This wasn't only about Vogt. It was never really about one mill owner's pride. It was about whether an entire town's collective claim of ignorance would be allowed to stand, unchallenged, the moment the army moved on to the next objective, which it needed to do. Soon. The front was still advancing. Every hour spent on this road was an hour the rest of the war didn't pause for. Engines from other convoys were still running elsewhere along the line. Drivers checking watches, officers folding and unfolding the same maps, waiting on word from up ahead. Somewhere east, fuel trucks were idling behind a column that couldn't move until this column moved. Patton hadn't stopped the war to make this happen. He had carved out one fixed point inside it and let the advance continue everywhere else. Because some things, once seen and pushed aside, do not come back around for correction later. The practical solution wasn't elegant. It was shovels and a road full of well-dressed people doing work they had never once imagined doing, supervised by men who had buried the dead themselves for over a week already and had stopped flinching at it days ago. It made momentum and consequence run side by side instead of trading one for the other. The column outside the wire never stopped rolling east. This piece of ground simply stopped pretending nothing had happened on it. What stayed with the soldiers who watched it, more than anything, Patton said, was the silence afterward. Not shouting, not protest, just men who had spent their whole adult lives being believed without question, standing quietly with shovels in their hands, the certainty gone out of their faces for good. By the time the civilians were walked back down the same road they'd entered on, hours later, something in the way they carried themselves had changed. The line moving back toward town was slower than the line that had come in that morning. Nobody pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths on the way out. There wasn't a need to perform shock anymore. A shovel stood upright in the turned earth where the work had stopped for the day. The road, finally, went quiet. Not the silence of denial this time, but the kind that comes only after something has actually been seen and can no longer be unseen. The convoys kept moving. The war had perhaps 4 more weeks left in it. And the road outside Ohrdruf, the one that had carried wagons and bicycles and a town's careful blindness for months on end, carried something else back into town that afternoon. Men who could no longer say they hadn't known, walking home in coats that no longer seemed to fit the men wearing them quite the same way as before. Was Patton right to force it? Should the matter have been pushed weeks earlier, the moment the smoke first reached the edge of town? Did forcing a respected man to pick up a shovel actually change what he believed, deep down, or only what he was willing to say out loud afterward? Would another commander have settled for a signed statement and moved on to the next town, the next road, the next problem? The road went quiet that day. Whether the silence held for good, long after the jeeps were gone, is a different question entirely.